This evening we again continue the homily series that I've been giving. It's been a long series so far, but on these very important cultural issues of our time. And again, I remind us that the only way for us to understand the beauty and the joy that the teachings of the church are meant to bring is that we place it within the context of the gospel. And so maybe you've gotten tired of me repeating what that is, but we need to hear it again and again, that God created all of us in his image, to know and to love him, to be in relationship with him and with one another. Unfortunately, though, that through the envy of the devil, the sin and death and suffering entered into our world, disordering many of our thoughts and desires and behaviors. And that included an attack upon marriage, family life, and even the core of our being, our identity, who we are. But God came to defeat the enemy. He came to right the wrong and to heal the wound, to rescue us and restore us to new life through the passion, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so all of us are invited to be joined to Jesus' body, the church, and to receive back our identity as his beloved children, and to also lead others to this beautiful truth as well. And so I've applied this gospel message to a number of different issues so far: abortion, contraception, IVF, same-sex attraction last week. And this week I want to apply it to another. I want to apply our Christian worldview to another, and that is the whole area of gender identity. According to a 2020 Gallup poll, about 0.6% of U.S. adults self-identify as transgender. And gender dysphoria, to use the scientific term, is a condition where someone's perception of themselves doesn't match with the biology of their physical body. Say a biological man seeing himself as a woman, or a biological woman seeing herself as a man. So just like anybody, those with this desire to understand themselves, who they are, and to be loved and to be accepted by others. And this desire for acceptance have led many of those with gender dysphoria into this kind of LGBT community, where sexual orientation and identities end up being celebrated as the defining characteristic of that person's being. And as I noted last week, same case for those with same-sex attraction, those with gender dysphoria should also be accepted with respect and compassion and sensitivity. But just like every single person, they too are wanted by God and his church. But we have a greater vision for who they are, a different understanding, a way of understanding their identity. Because the most fundamental truth about every human being is that we've been created in God's image. And through Jesus Christ, we are now called to be his adopted sons and daughters. So important is that truth that we saw. That was precisely what was the point of the opening prayer at today's Mass. That's our identity. So let's look more closely at this biblical vision and how it applies here. So it goes all the way back to the beginning, the first chapter of Genesis. It says that God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So unique from all the creatures, God created us human beings in his image. And while other creatures may have physical bodies, just like we have physical bodies, they're unable to know and to love in a way that we human beings can, following the very life of God himself. No other creature can make free choices. Animals, they'll act on instinct. They don't have a spiritual soul with a free will to make those kinds of choices. And no other physical creature besides us will spend time thinking about how we're different from all the other creatures. I don't think there's any of your pets or livestock that are right now currently thinking about those things. We are the only ones with a spiritual soul and a rational intellect that think through these kinds of things. So human beings are physical bodies, and we're spiritual souls. As Genesis chapter 2 describes it, it says that the Lord God formed man out of the clay of the ground, and then he breathed the breath of God, breath of life, into us. And so those two elements represent the clay, the physical part of us, and God's breath of life, the spiritual soul. So we're a union of physical and spiritual. And from the very moment of the existence of every human being, God himself infuses the spiritual soul into the body. This is actually how we theologically think about death, too. For near the end of life, when the physical body begins to deteriorate and can no longer be joined to the spiritual soul, that moment of separation between body and soul is what we call death. We also find in Genesis here it's that this human union of body and soul in each of us is found both as male and female. That God designs the body and soul so much as to go together, to create one whole person. So how does this all apply to gender dysphoria? Well, to sometimes hear even Christian parents of a child that are expressing gender dysphoria, they'll sometimes say, well, God has made them this way. And they have the good desire to try to help their child understand what's going on within. And even though this is a good intention, they inadvertently, through this interpretation, undermine the entire possibility of us being made in God's image. You see, because it makes the claim that for some people, their physical bodies are designed to be in conflict with their spiritual souls. That somehow, say, a male body can be matched up with a female soul, or vice versa. That God doesn't actually create us as a body and soul unity, with bodies and souls that are designed to go with one another. And they might even say something like, well, God doesn't make mistakes with regard to the soul, while at the same time acting as though God has made a mistake with that person's body. So this idea of transgenderism is really a new version of a very old error in the early church that was called dualism, Gnostic dualism. The idea that the physical body really doesn't have anything to do with one's real self. They taught during that time that the body was actually bad, while it was the soul that was good. That the real self is just what's going on inside. That the physical body is just kind of a shell that can be discarded. But the early church condemned this kind of dualism because it undermines this biblical vision that God has created us good. Both our body and soul are good. It also happens that this kind of separation between body and soul for the human being undermines the very incarnation of Jesus Christ and the entire plan of salvation. Because we believe that Jesus took upon himself the entirety of our human nature. He took upon a full human body and soul. That he wasn't just God in some kind of false human appearance. Because if Jesus didn't have a real body, then he wouldn't have been able to suffer and die and rise again in that body. He wouldn't have been able to give his body to us as food in the Eucharist, as he says that he does in today's gospel. The acceptance of gender theory is not only a rejection of us as human beings being made in God's image, but it's also rejection of the person of Jesus Christ. And gender theory ends up leading to a very kind of radical autonomy. Pope Benedict said back in 2012 that these ideas cause the person to deny that there is such a thing as human nature, that it's been given to us by God at all. But rather, we're the ones who make up completely who we are for ourselves. And that is really illustrated by the ever-increasing identities that are created to describe each individual to be who they would like to be termed. They're looking for happiness, but they're looking in a kind of complete independence from God and even from physical nature, trying to find it in just self-affirmation alone. But as Pope Benedict sadly notes, this will only end up in tragic loneliness. When one's identity and meaning becomes nothing more than what you determine for yourself, then you lose your true identity in being made good by God. and called to be his adopted children through God, through Jesus Christ. And so someone might ask, well then does the Catholic Church deny the existence of people that experience gender dysphoria? Certainly not. No, we do recognize there are those who struggle with that. And we bring in the second part of the gospel message to help us understand why that is the case. Remember that it was through the envy of the devil that sin and death and disorder came into our human nature. So according to God's original plan, the human body and soul are meant to function together as a unity, to fit perfectly together. But as a result of original sin, our physical bodies and spiritual souls are often in conflict with one another. And St. Paul talks about this all the time in the Scriptures. For example, he says to the Galatians that the flesh has desires against the spirit and the spirit against the flesh. These are opposed to each other so that you may not do what you want. Or Jesus himself was used this as well. He says the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. You see, before the fall, we had been given the gift of integrity between our body and soul. But with original sin, the different faculties of body and soul can be in conflict with one another. And that's behind all the disorders that we experience in our lives, whether they're in the body or the mind. And so from the Christian point of view, it's not surprising that this division brought about by the fall between body and soul could be experienced even to the extent of gender dysphoria. As I mentioned last week about same-sex attraction, it's true, too, for those who experience gender dysphoria. It's not as if they are somehow uniquely more disordered than anybody else. No. All of us are disordered in different ways because of the fall. We all experience different ways in which we're not ordered to the way that God has created us. But the good news of the gospel is that God did not leave us to simply remain with our disordered nature, our fallen human state. That Jesus Christ came to redeem us. St. Paul, he asks, "Miserable one that I am, who will deliver me from this state?" Praise be to God through Jesus Christ. But in our world today, influenced by the LGBT movement, the primary assistance that's given to those with gender dysphoria is to just simply affirm their interior perception of themselves, to affirm the idea that what they feel inside doesn't match with what their body, and so their body must be changed through changing external things like their name or clothing or behaviors, hormonal treatments, including things like delaying puberty for adolescents, or even going all the way to surgery. But none of those steps actually can change the body, since the determination of whether someone is male or female is encoded into every single cell of the body in our DNA. Something that simply can't be changed. And nowhere else in the medical science is this advocated for. For in all the cases, when we have someone's perception that doesn't match the reality of their body, we seek to help their perception to change. For example, somebody with body integrity disorder who might wish to amputate their arm because they have this perception that it's not actually their own, doctors will certainly not go ahead and remove the limb. No, instead they will seek to try to help that individual to change their perception of their arm. Similar thing with something like anorexia. It would be life-threatening to that person to affirm and tell them, yes, we agree with your perception. You indeed are overweight. When the reality is that they're actually malnourished. See, the practice of hormonal treatment and surgery is especially dangerous, too, for children who experience gender dysphoria. Because, as we've found through studies, that only a minority of children who actually experience cross-gender identification will continue to do so into adolescence and into adulthood. And we can't discount those who, having been affirmed earlier in their life to go those routes, later find that it doesn't actually bring the lasting happiness that they were looking for. And they then try to seek to reverse those steps as much as they're able. See, the Christian approach to those with gender dysphoria is to seek what will truly help them. As in our first reading, when Elijah begins to experience feelings of despair, God doesn't just affirm him in his hopelessness. No, God comes to bring him comfort and to strengthen him, to bring him hope, to bring him a new vision, a new way of looking at his situation. In 2015, Pope Francis said, I ask myself if this so-called gender theory is not an expression of frustration and resignation, which seeks to cancel out sexual difference because it no longer knows how to confront it. You see, without the explanatory power of the gospel, it can be very difficult to see past the effects of the fall to what God's original plan was for us. Pope Francis has also written about valuing one's own body in its femininity and masculinity. He says, learning to accept our body and to care for it and to respect its fullest meaning is an essential element of any genuine human ecology. So what should be done for those with gender dysphoria? Well, to first love those that are hurting, who are wounded, to walk with them, to listen to them, what they're experiencing, but also to help them see themselves as God sees them. That they are created good, soul and body, male or female, in the image of God, invited to be an adopted son or daughter of the Father, that their perception of themselves will more accurately match with the truth of how God has created and loves them.